limpias todo el camino. Agua, enséñanos el destino. Agua, que limpias todo el camino. Agua, enséñanos el destino. Fluye, 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 fluir hacia el mar. Fluye, 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 fluir hacia el mar.
There's a voice in your head right now. As you read these words, chances are you're hearing them spoken in your mind, narrated in what sounds like your own voice, or maybe someone else's. You might be commenting on what you're reading, questioning it, agreeing or disagreeing with a running internal dialogue that never quite shuts off. This is so natural, so fundamental to your experience of consciousness that you probably never stop to question it. But here's something that might surprise you. Not everyone has that voice. Not everyone experiences this constant internal narrator, this stream of verbal thoughts that seems to define what it means to think. For some people, consciousness is something else entirely, a kind of awareness that exists without words, without sentences, without that familiar sense of talking to yourself inside your own mind. Take a moment to consider what that would be like. Imagine experiencing the world without that internal commentary, without mentally rehearsing conversations before they happen, without talking yourself through problems or silently reading in your head. It's almost impossible to conceive of if you're someone who has always had an inner voice. It would be like trying to imagine what it's like to not see colors if you've had color vision your entire life. This internal experience, this phenomenon that psychologists call inner speech, has become one of the most fascinating frontiers in our understanding of consciousness, cognition, and what it actually means to be aware.
Despierta la maravilla. Cura, 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 curar el dolor. Cura, 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 curar el dolor.
It touches on fundamental questions about the nature of thought itself. Is thinking the same thing as having an inner monologue? Can you truly think without words? And if so, what does that say about the relationship between language and consciousness?
So like if you look, like I could look at myself in the mirror, talk in my head without opening my mouth. You physically can't do that.
No.
And what would happen if you tried to do that?
I have tried to do that since learning that an internal monologue exists, and I end up speaking out loud to myself, so most of my conversations are out loud.
I feel like this information to the people that can think in their head is a lot more like exciting news. I've talked to a few people that can't do this, and they seem less enthused as the people that do have this internal monologue.
Correct.
Does that make sense?
Yep. I'm very confused as to why people are so perplexed
Alright,
by
so
it.
The reality is that inner speech exists on a vast spectrum, and understanding where you fall on that spectrum might tell you something profound about how your mind works, how you developed as a person, and even how you relate to your own mental health. Some people talk to themselves internally almost constantly, narrating their every action and thought. Others experience inner speech only occasionally, in specific situations, and a small percentage of people report having no internal monologue at all, living in what one researcher described as a kind of mental silence that's equally rich and complex, just fundamentally different. When scientists first started trying to study this phenomenon, they ran into an immediate and obvious problem. How do you measure something that happens entirely inside someone's head? How do you study an experience that's completely private, that can't be observed or recorded, that exists only in the subjective awareness of the person experiencing it? You can't hook up electrodes and see inner speech on a monitor. You can't take a blood test for it. You can't even really describe it adequately to someone who doesn't experience it the same way you do.
Probably most requested question was, how do you read? Like, when I read, I hear the words in my head. I don't know how you could possibly read without not hearing the words.
When I read, I can see the sentence structure. Like, in my head, every sentence has a shape, so you can see, like, the shape of the sentence. And then also, like, keywords will pop out, and I can file those away into my, like, concept map. So at the end of reading something, I can have a concept map of the main topics that I read about. And I tend to move my lips when I read. So, like, essentially I'm saying it out loud, but it's just not, like, audible.
So, do you visualize the setting when you're reading a book?
No, it's not like images. It's just the words.
So, do you like reading, like, fiction books, like, where you have to put yourself in a situation?
I never really enjoyed reading.
At all?
I think maybe that's why. Like, I can see the story plot.
Are you a fast reader?
Yes, very fast reader.
We could have a 100-question test. She's done when I'm on question 12. I'm not even kidding. It is superhuman. It's not fair. How do you know what you're thinking if there's no words?
Because I can see it.
I think that's why this whole thing is going viral, is because people like me can't understand how you get through a day without talking to yourself.
I don't know, I just feel like the information is in there, and I can pull it forward if I want it. Like, it's all just, like, it's like files. There's categories of information in my head, and I can pull them to the front if I need them. But
I feel like I could do that. Like, if I'm studying, I could, like, pull things out. But just, like, if I'm sitting and, like, I have a thought, or someone is, like, walking by and I have a thought about that person, I'm, like, talking to myself about that. Does that not happen to you?
no, If I have a thought, normally I say it out loud.
This challenge has led to decades of fragmented research, contradictory findings, and heated debates among psychologists about even the most basic questions. How many people actually have inner speech? How often does it occur? What purpose does it serve? These might seem like simple questions, but they've proven remarkably difficult to answer with any certainty. Early research tried to peek inside people's heads by prompting specific kinds of internal verbal experiences. Scientists would ask participants to read something silently, or to determine whether two words rhymed without saying them out loud, or to imagine hearing a specific phrase in their mind. These studies revealed some interesting quirks about how inner speech works. For instance, when people read silently, they don't actually mentally vocalize every single word. Instead, their inner voice tends to compress information, using single words to represent entire passages or concepts. It's a kind of mental shorthand that makes reading much faster than it would be if you actually had to hear every word spoken in your head. But there's a fundamental problem with this approach. Prompted inner speech isn't the same thing as spontaneous inner speech. Just because someone can mentally recite a phrase when asked to, doesn't tell you anything about whether they naturally think in words throughout their daily life. It's like the difference between making someone laugh by tickling them versus understanding what they actually find funny. You're measuring a response to a specific stimulus, not capturing the natural phenomenon. So researchers turned to questionnaires instead, asking people to report on their own inner experiences. This approach revealed something unexpected and honestly quite depressing about the content of our internal dialogues. According to these surveys, the conversations we have with ourselves are overwhelmingly negative. Most inner speech consists of criticism, doubt, worry, and self-judgment. We mentally replay embarrassing moments, torture ourselves with anxious thoughts about the future, and engage in brutal self-assessment that we would never direct at another person. Think about your own inner voice for a moment. How often is it kind versus critical? How often does it build you up versus tear you down? For most people, the answer is unsettling. Our internal narrator tends to be our harshest critic, relentlessly pointing out flaws, mistakes, and inadequacies. We tell ourselves we're not good enough, smart enough, attractive enough. We replay failed conversations and imagine worst-case scenarios. We second-guess our decisions and doubt our abilities. And curiously, all of this tends to happen in complete sentences. About 2/3 of people report that their inner speech is grammatically full and proper, with subjects and predicates and all the structure of external speech. Only about 1/3 of people experience what researchers call abbreviated inner speech, where a single word or short phrase can represent an entire complex thought. This is the opposite of what happens when we read Creating an Interesting Asymmetry. When we take in language, our inner voice compresses it. When we generate our own thoughts, it expands them into full verbal form. But questionnaires have their own serious limitations. The biggest issue is that people are generally terrible at accurately reporting their own internal experiences. We're not very good at introspection, at least not in the systematic way that science requires. We tend to notice and remember unusual or emotionally significant thoughts more than routine ones. We confabulate and rationalize. We're influenced by our beliefs about how we think we should think. All of this means that questionnaires probably overestimate how much inner speech people actually experience. This led researchers to develop a more sophisticated method called Descriptive Experience Sampling, or DES. The idea is elegantly simple. Give people a beeper that goes off at random times throughout the day. Whenever it beeps, they immediately write down exactly what was going through their mind at that precise moment. It's like having someone tap you on the shoulder and ask what you're thinking about, except done randomly enough to capture a representative sample of your mental experience. This method isn't perfect either. Some critics argue that the act of stopping to analyze your thoughts might change those thoughts, creating a kind of quantum observer effect for consciousness. Others point out that people might not be able to accurately capture or describe what was in their mind in the split second before the beeper went off. Memory is reconstructive, and even very recent memories can be unreliable. Despite these limitations, DES has given us our best glimpse so far into the actual frequency and nature of spontaneous inner speech. What it reveals is that inner monologues, like almost everything in psychology, exist on a spectrum rather than as a binary presence or absence. Very few people have no inner speech whatsoever, and very few people engage in constant, uninterrupted internal verbal thought. Most of us fall somewhere in between. According to DES studies, somewhere between 70 and 85% of people experience spontaneous inner speech at least some of the time. And for those who do experience it, it typically occupies between 15 and 30% of their waking consciousness. Stop and think about what that means. If you're someone who assumed you were constantly talking to yourself internally, the reality might be that you're doing so less than 1/3 of the time. The rest of your consciousness is filled with other kinds of mental experience: visual imagery, sensory awareness, emotions, wordless intuitions, and processes that happen below the level of conscious awareness entirely. Your mind is doing far more than your inner voice ever hints at. It's also possible, and indeed common, to have multiple forms of internal experience happening simultaneously. You might be visualizing something while also verbally describing it to yourself. You might be feeling an emotion while also trying to name and analyze it with inner speech. Consciousness isn't a single stream, but rather multiple parallel processes, some verbal, some not, all contributing to your moment-to-moment experience of being aware. The nature of inner speech varies in other fascinating ways too. While we often talk about this phenomenon as an internal monologue, suggesting a single voice speaking continuously, the reality is more complex and often more interesting. About 75% of people report that at least some of their inner speech takes the form of dialogues, with two or more voices having back and forth conversations inside their head. Now here's where it gets really intriguing. Most people play both parts in these internal dialogues themselves. It's not like having another person in your head. It's more like being both the actor and the director, both the speaker and the listener, simultaneously performing both roles in an internal theatrical production. You argue with yourself, question yourself, answer yourself, all while knowing that both voices are ultimately you. But about a quarter of people report something different. For them, other people occasionally show up in their inner speech. They might hear their mother's voice offering advice, or a friend's voice posing a question, or a mentor's voice providing encouragement. This isn't the same as auditory hallucination. These people understand that they're generating these voices themselves. It's more like having a particularly vivid imagination for dialogue, being able to simulate other people's voices and perspectives with enough detail that they feel distinct from your own. Interestingly, people who had imaginary friends as children are significantly more likely to experience this kind of dialogic inner speech with distinct other voices, even long after the imaginary friend has disappeared. There's something rather beautiful about this finding, suggesting that the capacity to create and engage with imaginary others in childhood might leave a lasting imprint on the structure of adult consciousness. Those childhood games of make-believe might actually shape the fundamental architecture of how you think. Related to this is a phenomenon psychologists call imagined interactions. This is when you mentally rehearse conversations before they happen, or replay conversations that already occurred, usually while coming up with better things you could have said. You know this experience. You're lying in bed at night, and suddenly you're having an elaborate imaginary conversation with your boss, perfectly articulating all the points you failed to make in the actual meeting that afternoon. Or you're in the shower mentally preparing for a difficult conversation you need to have later, trying out different ways to phrase things, anticipating how the other person might respond. These imagined interactions serve several purposes. They help us prepare for social situations, reducing anxiety by giving us a sense of control and readiness. They allow us to process past conversations, working through our emotional responses and sometimes gaining new insights. They let us practice social skills in a safe environment where there are no real consequences for getting it wrong, but they can also trap us in rumination, endlessly replaying painful conversations or anxiously anticipating ones that may never happen. What remains deeply unclear is why people differ so dramatically in their experience of inner speech. Why do some people have constant internal chatter, while others think in images or wordless concepts? Why do some people experience their inner voice as distinct and personality-filled, while others experience it as just vaguely themselves? What do these differences mean, and do they matter? We don't even really know where inner speech comes from in the first place, either evolutionarily or developmentally. From an evolutionary perspective, many researchers believe that inner speech emerged as a kind of byproduct or side effect of the capacity for overt external speech. The idea is that the brain developed the ability to simulate speech internally as part of the process of generating actual spoken language, and this simulation capacity then got repurposed for other cognitive functions. Here's how that might work. When you prepare to speak, your brain does something surprisingly sophisticated. It sends signals to two different areas simultaneously. One signal goes to the motor regions that actually control your mouth, tongue, and vocal cords, telling them how to move to produce the sounds you want to make. But a copy of that signal, what's called an efference copy, gets sent to the sensory regions of your brain that process hearing. This copy signal allows your brain to make a prediction about what it's about to hear. Essentially, you recite words in your head as you say them out loud, or rather, your brain creates an internal model of the sounds you're about to produce. This prediction serves a crucial function. It allows your brain to filter out the sound of your own voice from the auditory environment. Without this, the sound of your own speaking would be overwhelming and distracting, making it hard to hear other people or environmental sounds. The fascinating thing is that this same neural pattern, this same kind of internal auditory simulation, occurs during inner speech, even when you're not actually speaking aloud. When you talk to yourself in your head, you're literally activating the same auditory regions of your brain that would be active if you were listening to yourself speak out loud. In a very real sense, you're both speaking and hearing at the same time, except all of it is happening internally with no actual sound being produced. This might explain why inner speech feels like hearing yourself, why it has the qualities of sound even though it's silent. You're experiencing the prediction your brain would normally generate about your own voice, except divorced from any actual vocalization. It's the shadow of speech, the ghost of language passing through your mind. Some psychologists think this reveals the underlying purpose of inner speech, error detection and correction in speech production. The idea is that your brain compares the internal prediction of what you're about to say with what you actually say. If they match, everything is fine and your brain can filter out your own voice to focus on other sounds. If they don't match, like when you stumble over a word or mispronounce something, your brain flags the error so you can stop and correct yourself. This would suggest that inner speech is fundamentally about quality control for language production, a way of monitoring and refining our communication. It might explain why inner speech feels so intimately connected to our sense of thinking, because for social creatures like humans, the ability to communicate clearly and effectively has been absolutely crucial to survival and success. A brain mechanism that helps us speak more accurately would be highly adaptive. But this theory has some problems. For one thing, inner speech and the ability to speak can be separated from each other. There are documented cases of people who suffered brain damage that eliminated their inner speech while leaving their ability to talk completely intact. They can carry on normal conversations, produce grammatically correct sentences, and communicate effectively, all without any internal verbal thought. Conversely, there are people who have lost the ability to speak but still report robust inner speech, still experiencing that internal dialogue, even though they can no longer produce external speech. This suggests that while inner speech and overt speech might have evolved together and might share neural mechanisms, they're not the same thing and don't absolutely require each other. Error correction might have been the original evolutionary purpose, but inner speech has clearly been repurposed for other functions. One of the most compelling theories about these other functions focuses on childhood development and social learning. Some psychologists argue that our everyday inner speech in adulthood reflects conversations we had out loud as children, particularly moments when parents, teachers, or other caregivers talked us through solving problems or helped us regulate our emotions. Think about how adults interact with young children who are struggling with something difficult. A parent might say, okay, let's think about this step by step. What do we need to do first? Good. And what comes next? A teacher might help a child calm down from a tantrum by saying, take a deep breath. It's okay to feel angry, but we need to use words. Can you tell me what's wrong? These teaching moments, according to this theory, get internalized as we grow up. The external dialogue between adult and child gradually becomes an internal dialogue within the child's own mind. Eventually, you don't need your parent to walk you through problem solving. You can talk yourself through it using the structure and even the specific phrases they taught you. You don't need someone else to help you regulate your emotions. You can use inner speech to calm yourself down. This would explain several curious features of inner speech. It would explain why so much of it takes the form of dialogue, with different voices asking questions and providing answers. It would explain why the content often involves self-regulation, things like problem-solving, planning, time management, and motivation, all tasks that adults help children learn. It would explain why inner speech often feels like being guided or coached, like having a wise advisor in your head. There's even neuroscientific support for this idea. The same brain regions that are active during internal dialogic speech are also active when people think about someone else's perspective or try to imagine what another person is thinking. This overlap suggests that the voice in your head might be your brain recycling and simulating other people's voices and viewpoints, integrating their perspectives into your own thinking process. If this theory is correct, it would mean that differences in inner speech between people might simply reflect differences in their upbringings and social interactions. A child who had patient, encouraging parents who talked them through problems might develop rich, helpful inner speech. A child who was criticized harshly might develop harsh, critical inner speech. A child who spent a lot of time in dialogue with adults might develop more complex dialogic inner speech, while a child who spent more time in self-directed play might rely more on other forms of internal experience. We still don't know for certain how or whether these differences actually matter, but there's compelling evidence that inner speech plays important roles in cognition, those mental processes involved in thinking, reasoning, and problem solving. Scientists have used something called a dual task paradigm to investigate this. The basic idea is to ask someone to solve a problem while simultaneously doing something else, and see how that second task affects their performance. When the second task is physical, like tapping their foot in rhythm or squeezing a grip exerciser, people generally have no trouble solving the problem. Their performance is just as good as when they're solving the problem with full attention. But when the second task is verbal, like remembering a list of words or repeating a nonsense phrase over and over, their problem-solving ability decreases significantly. Researchers interpret this as evidence that people use inner speech to solve problems, talking themselves through the logical steps or considering different approaches verbally. When you force them to use their verbal processing capacity for something else, it disrupts their inner speech and makes problem solving harder. It's like trying to have a conversation with someone while someone else is also talking to you. The verbal interference makes it almost impossible to think clearly. Inner speech also appears to be crucial for a specific kind of memory called working memory. This is the memory system that holds information you need to access quickly in the short term, like remembering a phone number long enough to dial it, or keeping track of instructions while you're following them. One of the key components of working memory is called the phonological loop, which is essentially the ability to repeat information to yourself internally until you no longer need it. When you're trying to remember a phone number, you repeat it to yourself over and over. When you're following directions, you might verbally rehearse the next step. Turn left at the light, turn left at the light. This verbal rehearsal depends on inner speech, and without it, working memory performance suffers dramatically. People who engage in more self-management inner speech, meaning they regularly use internal dialogue to plan, organize, and talk themselves through tasks, tend to perform better on various cognitive tests. They're better at complex problem solving, better at staying focused on long-term goals, better at delaying gratification. This suggests that differences in how people use inner speech might underlie meaningful differences in cognitive abilities and life outcomes. The connection between inner speech and mental health is equally significant and considerably more concerning. Multiple studies have linked patterns of inner speech to depression and anxiety. People who have more depressive tendencies experience more depressive self-talk, those brutal internal monologues of self-criticism and hopelessness. People with anxiety engage in more anxious rumination, endlessly turning over worries in verbal form. What's not clear is the direction of causation. Does negative inner speech cause or worsen mental health problems? Or do mental health problems lead to more negative inner speech? It's probably bidirectional, a vicious cycle where each reinforces the other. Depression makes your internal voice more critical and hopeless, and that critical, hopeless inner dialogue deepens your depression. Some research suggests that the verbal nature of inner speech might itself make people less happy. Studies have found that when you ask people to think verbally about hypothetical situations, even positive ones, their mood afterward is lower than if you ask them to simply visualize or imagine those same situations without words. There's something about translating experience into language, about narrating and analyzing and describing, that seems to diminish positive emotions and amplify negative ones. Perhaps this is because language is inherently about concepts and categories rather than direct experience. When you verbally think about something joyful, you're not directly experiencing that joy. You're thinking about the concept of the joy, which is inevitably less emotionally potent. Language also engages critical, analytical thinking, and analysis tends to find problems and inconsistencies. The more you talk about something, even something wonderful, the more you might notice its flaws or worry about its impermanence. The relationship between inner speech and psychotic disorders like schizophrenia is particularly intriguing. One of the most common symptoms of schizophrenia is auditory hallucination, hearing voices that seem to come from outside yourself, often voices that comment on your behavior or command you to do things. These experiences can be terrifying and debilitating, and they've been central to our understanding of what psychosis means. But some researchers have proposed a controversial theory. What if these voices aren't really coming from outside at all? What if they're actually the person's own inner speech, but their brain has failed to recognize it as self-generated? Remember that prediction signal, that efference copy that tells your brain when sounds are coming from your own speech. There's evidence that in people with schizophrenia, this system might be malfunctioning. If your brain loses the ability to tag thoughts as self-generated, then inner speech might feel alien and external. The voice in your head, which normally feels intimately like you, might suddenly seem like someone else talking to you. Your own thoughts might become unrecognizable as yours, experienced as intrusive and invasive rather than emanating from your own mind. This theory is still debated, and it's certainly not a complete explanation for all auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia, but it offers a fascinating window into just how much our sense of self depends on subtle neural tagging processes. The line between your thoughts and external stimuli, between you and not you, is maintained by delicate brain mechanisms that can break down. When they do, the result isn't just confusion, it's a fundamental disruption of the boundary between self and world, Given all these potential connections between inner speech and cognition, mental health, self-regulation, and consciousness itself, psychologists are understandably eager to understand this phenomenon better. Every answer raises new questions. Can you change your inner monologue? Can you train yourself to think more in dialogue versus monologue, or to hear other voices, or to reduce negative self-talk? Should you want to make those changes? If harsh inner speech is associated with depression, could learning to speak more kindly to yourself in your head actually treat depression? Some evidence from cognitive behavioral therapy and self-compassion practices suggests yes, but the effects are modest and the mechanisms unclear. If inner speech helps with problem solving, should people who don't naturally have much of it try to develop it? Or would that just introduce something alien and potentially disruptive to their existing cognitive style? We don't even know if there are downsides to having too much inner speech. Constant internal chatter might be exhausting, might prevent you from being fully present in your direct sensory experience, might trap you in overthinking. People who meditate often talk about learning to quiet their inner voice as a path to peace and clarity. But then again, inner speech might be protective, might help with emotional regulation and rational decision-making. The honest truth is that we're still in the very early stages of understanding inner speech, despite it being something most of us experience daily. The fundamental challenge of studying private, subjective experience hasn't been solved. Our methods are getting better, but they're still imperfect. There's significant disagreement among researchers about even basic questions, like how common inner speech actually is, or whether it should be considered primarily a linguistic phenomenon or something broader. Part of the difficulty is that inner speech is probably not one thing, but rather a category that encompasses several related but distinct phenomena. The inner speech you use to solve a math problem might be quite different from the inner speech you use to rehearse a conversation, might be different from the wandering internal commentary you experience when you're bored. These might involve different neural mechanisms and serve different functions, but we currently lump them all together under the same label. There's also a fascinating philosophical dimension to all of this that goes beyond the empirical questions psychology can address. Inner speech raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between language and thought. Philosophers have long debated whether thought requires language, or whether language is merely one way of expressing thoughts that exist independently. If some people genuinely lack inner speech but still solve problems, make plans, and have rich conscious experiences, that would seem to suggest that thought can exist without language. But maybe what they're doing isn't quite the same as what people with robust inner speech are doing when they think. Maybe there are actually multiple, fundamentally different ways of being conscious, different ways of having a mind. Or perhaps the question itself is confused, based on false assumptions about what thought and language are. Maybe inner speech isn't language at all, at least not in the same sense that external spoken language is. Maybe it's better understood as a kind of mental imagery, specifically auditory and linguistic imagery, that accompanies and supports thought without being identical to it. These philosophical questions don't have clear answers, and they probably can't be answered purely through neuroscience or psychology. They require careful conceptual analysis in addition to empirical research. But they matter, because how we understand inner speech shapes how we understand ourselves, how we think about the nature of the mind, and what it means to be a conscious thinking being. There's something deeply strange and wonderful about the fact that you're reading these words right now, possibly hearing them spoken in your head in a voice that sounds like you but isn't actually making any sound. You're experiencing language without speech, communication without another person, a kind of dialogue with yourself that somehow feels both intimate and slightly mysterious. The voice in your head is you, obviously, but it also sometimes feels like someone else, a companion or a critic or a coach who's separate enough to argue with. This doubling, this capacity to be both the speaker and the listener simultaneously, is part of what makes human consciousness so complex and so fascinating. We can step outside ourselves while remaining ourselves, observe our own thoughts while thinking them, create an internal space for reflection and deliberation. Whether this happens through inner speech or through other forms of internal experience, it represents something remarkable about how our minds work. For those who do experience robust inner speech, it can be hard to imagine what thinking would be like without it. The voice in your head might feel so fundamental to your sense of self that removing it would seem to remove you. But perhaps that's just another assumption worth questioning. Perhaps consciousness is far more flexible and multifaceted than any single mode of experience can capture. Perhaps there are ways of being aware, ways of thinking that we've barely begun to explore or understand. The people who don't have inner speech, or who have it only rarely, aren't missing something essential. They're not thinking less deeply or experiencing consciousness less fully. They're simply experiencing it differently, in a way that's equally valid and equally human. Their thoughts flow through different channels, manifest in different forms, accomplish the same cognitive work through different means. This diversity in how people experience their own minds should humble us. It's a reminder that consciousness isn't one thing but many things, that there's no single correct way to be aware or to think. What seems absolutely fundamental and universal to you might be optional or even absent for someone else. What seems impossible to imagine might be someone else's everyday reality. As research continues, as our methods improve and our understanding deepens, we may discover even more variation in internal experience than we currently recognize. We might find that the spectrum of inner speech is even broader, that the forms it takes are even more diverse than we've so far documented. We might discover new dimensions of variation we haven't thought to look for yet. We might also discover practical applications for this knowledge. If we better understand how inner speech develops and what factors shape it, we might be able to design better educational interventions for children struggling with self-regulation or problem-solving. If we understand the relationship between inner speech patterns and mental health, we might develop more effective treatments for depression, anxiety, and psychotic disorders. If we understand the cognitive advantages and disadvantages of different inner speech styles, we might help people optimize how they think and talk to themselves. But even without those practical applications, the study of inner speech is worthwhile for its own sake, as an attempt to understand one of the most intimate and private aspects of human experience. The voice in your head, or its absence, is part of what makes you who you are. It's part of the texture of your consciousness, the felt quality of what it's like to be you. Understanding it better means understanding yourself better, and understanding the remarkable diversity of human consciousness. So pay attention to your inner speech, or to its absence. Notice when it happens and when it doesn't. Notice what form it takes, whether monologue or dialogue, whether in full sentences or fragments. Notice the tone, whether kind or critical, encouraging or discouraging. Notice whose voice you hear, whether your own or others, and what that might say about your developmental history and current relationships. You might discover something surprising about yourself. You might find that your inner experience is more varied than you thought, that sometimes you think in words and sometimes you don't. You might notice patterns you've never been conscious of, like using inner speech more when you're anxious or less when you're absorbed in a physical activity. You might become more aware of how you talk to yourself and consider whether that's how you want to be talking to yourself. The voice in your head, if you have one, is both your oldest companion and potentially your harshest critic. It's been with you for most of your life, narrating your experience, offering commentary, asking questions, providing answers. It might be worth getting to know it better, understanding where it came from and what purpose it serves. It might be worth learning to treat it, and therefore yourself, with more compassion and curiosity. And if you don't have that voice, if your consciousness flows through other channels, that's worth honoring too. You're not broken or missing anything. You're simply built differently, experiencing the world through a different architecture of awareness. Your thoughts are no less valuable, your insights no less profound, your consciousness no less rich. We are, all of us, alone in our heads in some fundamental way. No one else can directly access your internal experience, whether that experience involves a constant chattering voice or silent awareness or something else entirely. But we're also connected by our shared humanity, by the fact that we're all conscious beings trying to understand what it means to have a mind. The study of inner speech is ultimately the study of consciousness itself, an attempt to map the vast, strange territory of subjective experience. It's a journey of discovery that's only just beginning, and we have no idea what we'll find as we explore further. But the journey itself is worthwhile, this attempt to illuminate what has always been hidden, to make explicit what has always been implicit, to understand what has always simply been. The practice of meditation offers another fascinating lens through which to understand inner speech and its role in consciousness. Many meditation traditions explicitly teach practitioners to quiet their inner voice, to move beyond the constant verbal chatter and into what's sometimes called pure awareness or mindfulness. The goal is often described as getting out of your head, stopping the endless internal narration that meditation teachers argue keeps us trapped in the past or future rather than present in the current moment. For people with active inner speech, the first attempts at meditation can be surprisingly frustrating. You sit down, close your eyes, try to focus on your breath, and immediately discover just how constant and insistent that voice in your head really is. It comments on the meditation itself, it wonders if you're doing it right, it makes grocery lists, it replays conversations from earlier in the day, it worries about things you need to do later. The instruction to simply observe thoughts without engaging with them reveals just how automatically we engage with our inner speech, how reflexively we respond to every verbal thought as if it requires attention and elaboration. But with practice, many meditators report being able to create gaps in their inner speech, moments of mental silence where awareness continues, but verbal thought pauses. These experiences are often described as profoundly peaceful and restorative, like finally getting a break from a conversation partner who never stops talking. Some longtime meditators report that regular practice has fundamentally changed their baseline inner experience, reducing the frequency and intensity of inner speech even outside of meditation. This raises intriguing questions. If you can learn to reduce inner speech through meditation, and if doing so feels beneficial, does that suggest we have too much inner speech in modern life? Our contemporary world is saturated with language, with constant streams of words from media, advertising, social media, books, conversations. Perhaps our brains weren't designed to handle this much linguistic input, and the result is an overactive inner voice, a kind of linguistic overstimulation. Traditional cultures with less literacy and less constant media exposure might have different patterns of inner speech. Unfortunately, this is very difficult to study because the research methods we have for investigating inner speech are themselves deeply embedded in literate, Western, psychologically oriented culture. The very act of asking someone to introspect about and describe their inner experience assumes a certain cultural framework and might change the phenomenon you're trying to measure. There's also the question of whether inner speech varies across languages and cultures. Does the structure of your native language shape the structure of your inner speech? Does growing up bilingual create a bilingual inner voice? And if so, how do the two languages interact? Do people switch languages in their inner speech depending on context or content? Some research suggests that bilinguals do report experiencing inner speech in different languages, sometimes within the same thought, and that the language of their inner speech can shift based on who they're with or what they're thinking about. Cultural attitudes towards self-reflection and introspection might also play a role. Western cultures, particularly in academic and therapeutic contexts, place enormous value on self-examination, on analyzing your thoughts and feelings, on being aware of and able to articulate your internal states. This cultural emphasis might encourage more elaborate and frequent inner speech. Cultures that emphasize harmony, social connection, and outward behavior over internal states might produce different patterns of internal experience. The relationship between inner speech and the written word deserves consideration as well. Reading and writing are relatively recent inventions in human history, and widespread literacy is newer still. For most of human existence, language was exclusively spoken and heard, not read and written. The alphabet, that technology that turns spoken sounds into visual symbols, fundamentally changed how humans think about language. It made language seem more permanent, more objective, more thing-like. Learning to read might actually strengthen or even partly create the phenomenon of inner speech as we currently experience it. When you learn to decode written symbols into sounds and meanings, you're training your brain to activate auditory language processing without any actual sound. You're literally practicing silent speech, learning to hear words that aren't being spoken. Perhaps it's no coincidence that concerns about and studies of inner speech have emerged primarily in highly literate societies. Before literacy became widespread, what was internal experience like? Did people have less inner speech or different kinds? We have no way to know directly, but we can look at clues from literature and philosophy. Ancient texts often describe thinking in terms that don't clearly map onto our modern concept of inner speech. When Homer described characters deliberating, he depicted it not as internal dialogue, but as being pulled between different external forces, or listening to the counsel of gods. Whether this reflects actual differences in internal experience, or merely different ways of describing the same thing, we can't be certain. The development of silent reading itself is historically recent. In ancient and medieval times, reading aloud was the norm. St. Augustine famously expressed surprise in his Confessions when he observed Bishop Ambrose reading silently, noting it as an unusual practice. The gradual shift from reading aloud to reading silently might have encouraged or required people to develop more elaborate inner speech, to have a clearer sense of an internal voice that could recite text. This historical perspective should make us cautious about assuming that contemporary Western patterns of inner speech represent some universal human constant. We might be studying a phenomenon that's partly culturally constructed, shaped by literacy, education, media saturation, and particular ways of thinking about the self and consciousness that are more local and temporary than we realize. Looking forward, there are several directions this research might take. Neuroscience continues to develop better tools for studying brain activity, including techniques that might eventually allow real-time tracking of inner speech as it happens. Imagine being able to see through brain imaging when someone is talking to themselves, what regions are active, how the pattern differs between different types of inner speech. We're not there yet, but we're moving in that direction. There's also growing interest in how inner speech might be relevant for artificial intelligence. As we try to build AI systems that can reason and plan and solve problems the way humans do, should those systems have something analogous to inner speech? Would an AI that verbally narrates its reasoning process to itself be more effective than one that operates through non-linguistic computation? Some researchers think that language might be essential for certain types of abstract reasoning, suggesting that human-level AI might need to think in words. The flip side of that question is whether humans might benefit from learning to think more like people without much inner speech, relying more on visualization, intuition, and wordless processing. There's a tendency to privilege verbal thinking as more sophisticated or rational, but that might just be bias. Some of the most creative and insightful people report that their best ideas come not through verbal analysis, but through sudden, intuitive insights, visual imagery, or bodily felt senses that they only later translate into words. The field of cognitive diversity is also relevant here. Just as we now recognize that there are many different learning styles and that neurodiversity encompasses a wide range of cognitive profiles, we're beginning to acknowledge that internal experience varies dramatically between people. Inner speech is just one dimension of that variation. Some people have highly vivid visual imagination while others have aphantasia, the inability to form mental images. Some people have perfect pitch or highly developed tactile sensibilities. The landscape of possible conscious experiences is vast. Understanding and honoring this cognitive diversity matters for education, for mental health treatment, for workplace environments, for how we design technology and communication systems. If teaching methods assume everyone thinks verbally and step by step, they'll fail students who think more holistically or visually. If therapy techniques rely heavily on verbal self-analysis, they might not work well for people with limited inner speech. If we design user interfaces assuming everyone mentally narrates what they're doing, we'll create products that don't fit how many people actually think. There's also potential for inner speech research to inform our understanding of language disorders and developmental differences. Children with autism spectrum disorder, for instance, often show atypical patterns of inner speech development. Some appear to develop inner speech later than typical, while others might rely on it more heavily as a way to manage sensory overload and navigate social complexity. Understanding these differences could lead to better support and intervention strategies. Similarly, people with ADHD often report different patterns of inner speech. Some describe their inner voice as chaotic and hard to control, constantly jumping between topics and generating intrusive thoughts. Others report that their inner speech is less frequent or consistent than they observe in others, which might contribute to difficulties with planning and impulse control. Recognizing that inner speech differences might be part of the ADHD profile could change how we approach treatment and coping strategies. Language development in children is another area where inner speech becomes interesting. Young children often engage in what's called private speech, talking out loud to themselves while playing or working on tasks. This isn't the same as inner speech, it's actual vocalization, but around age 5 to 7, private speech typically becomes internalized, going quiet and transforming into inner speech. The transition from talking to yourself out loud to talking to yourself silently represents a major milestone in cognitive development. Children who struggle with this transition, who continue to need to talk aloud to themselves well into elementary school, might face social stigma. Their classmates might think they're weird, and teachers might see them as disruptive. But this external speech serves the same self-regulatory and problem-solving functions that inner speech does for other children. Rather than trying to suppress it, we might do better to create environments where private speech is accepted, and then gradually support the internalization process at each child's own pace. The role of emotion in inner speech hasn't been fully explored but seems crucial. Think about how different your inner voice sounds when you're confident versus anxious, when you're excited versus depressed, when you're angry versus content. The emotional quality of inner speech isn't just about content, what you're saying to yourself, but also tone, pacing, and intensity. When you're anxious, your inner voice might become faster, louder, more insistent. When you're depressed, it might become slower, quieter, or more monotonous. This emotional coloring of inner speech might be part of how emotions sustain themselves. An anxious inner voice generates anxious content, which triggers more anxiety, which makes the inner voice more anxious, creating a feedback loop. Learning to change the tone of your inner speech, not just its content, might be a powerful emotional regulation tool. Speaking more slowly and gently to yourself, even while thinking about difficult topics, might help break cycles of rumination and escalation. There's also the fascinating question of what happens to inner speech during dreams. Most people don't report extensive verbal thought in dreams. Dreams are typically more visual and emotional than linguistic, but some people do experience dialogue in dreams, conversations with dream characters, or even internal monologues. The relationship between waking inner speech and dream speech remains mysterious. Do people with more elaborate waking inner speech also have more verbal dreams? Does the content of dream dialogue resemble the content of waking inner speech? The phenomenon of lucid dreaming, where you become aware that you're dreaming while still in the dream, often involves inner speech. Lucid dreamers report using self-talk to maintain lucidity, to deliberately shape the dream, to remind themselves of their goals. The inner voice becomes a tool for metacognition within the dream state, a way of maintaining a thread of waking-like rational thought in the midst of dream logic. Returning to mental health, there's an entire therapeutic approach called metacognitive therapy that specifically targets maladaptive thought patterns, including problematic inner speech. The idea is that it's not just what you think, but how you relate to your thoughts that matters. If you believe every thought your inner voice generates, if you treat your internal dialogue as truth rather than just mental events, you're more vulnerable to depression and anxiety. Metacognitive therapy teaches people to step back from their inner speech, to observe it with some distance and skepticism. Instead of thinking, I'm worthless, and accepting that as fact, you learn to think, I'm having the thought that I'm worthless, recognizing it as a mental event that might or might not be accurate. This subtle shift, this reframing of inner speech as something to observe rather than identify with, can be remarkably effective for some people. Compassion-focused therapy takes a related but different approach, specifically working to change the tone and content of inner speech toward greater self-compassion. Clients are taught to notice when their inner voice is harsh and critical, and to deliberately cultivate a warmer, more supportive internal tone. This might involve imagining what a caring friend would say to you in a difficult moment, or practicing specific phrases of self-compassion until they become more natural and automatic. The success of these therapeutic approaches provides indirect evidence that inner speech matters for mental health, and that it can be changed with deliberate effort. You're not stuck with the inner voice you have. The patterns of self-talk you've developed, even if they've been with you for decades, aren't immutable features of your psychology. They're habits, and like any habit, they can be examined, understood, and gradually shifted towards something more helpful and kind. But this also raises ethical questions. If we develop more powerful techniques for modifying inner speech, when should those techniques be used? If a person's inner voice is harsh and self-critical, but accurately reflects real problems they need to address, is it helpful or harmful to make that voice kinder? Could overly positive inner speech lead to complacency or lack of motivation? There's a balance to strike between self-compassion and self-deception, between being kind to yourself and being honest with yourself. There are also questions about authenticity and identity. If your inner voice has been a constant companion throughout your life, Even if it's often critical, changing it might feel like losing part of yourself. Who were you without that familiar internal narrator? Some people might resist changing their inner speech because it feels like the core of their identity, the essence of their self, even when it causes them pain. The relationship between inner speech and sense of self goes deep. For many people, the voice in their head feels like the real them, the true self behind the social masks and performances. Your inner voice is the you that no one else can hear, the private you that exists beyond judgment and social pressure. To change that voice might feel like changing who you fundamentally are. Yet we know that identity isn't fixed, that the self is more fluid and constructed than it often feels. The inner voice that seems so essentially you is itself shaped by external forces. Your parents' voices, your culture's narratives, your personal history of experiences and relationships. It's already a construction, already a kind of performance, even though it's a private one. Recognizing this might make it easier to experiment with changing it, to treat your inner speech as something you create rather than something you simply are. The future of inner speech research will likely involve better integration across different levels of analysis: the neural mechanisms, the cognitive functions, the developmental origins, the cultural variations, the individual differences, the therapeutic implications. These different perspectives aren't separate. They're all looking at different aspects of the same complex phenomenon. A complete understanding will require bringing them together into a more unified framework. We might also see more research on the positive aspects of inner speech, not just its role in pathology, but its role in flourishing. What characterizes the inner speech of highly resilient people, of creative innovators, of those who seem to maintain motivation and well-being despite challenges? Is there such a thing as optimal inner speech? And if so, what does it look like? How do we cultivate an inner voice that's both honest and encouraging, both realistic and hopeful? There's something profound and moving about the fact that humans have this capacity to split ourselves, to be both subject and object, observer and observed. We can watch our own thoughts, comment on our own experiences, argue with ourselves and comfort ourselves. This doubling of consciousness, this reflexive self-awareness, is part of what makes human minds so sophisticated and so strange. Whether it manifests as constant verbal chatter or occasional brief phrases or something else entirely, this capacity to be aware of being aware, to think about thinking, represents something remarkable. It allows us to learn from experience by reflecting on it, to imagine different futures by verbally exploring possibilities, to understand others by simulating their perspectives in our own mind. The voice in your head, or whatever form your inner experience takes, is doing immense cognitive work that you're mostly unaware of. It's helping you remember, plan, decide, regulate, understand. It's keeping you company in solitude and helping you prepare for social interaction. It's processing your experiences and integrating them into your ongoing narrative of who you are and what your life means. So listen to the voice in your head or notice its absence. Either way, you're experiencing one of the great mysteries of being human, one of the profound puzzles of consciousness. And in paying attention to it, in becoming curious about it, you're participating in humanity's long attempt to understand itself, to figure out what we are and how we work and what it all means. That's a conversation worth having, whether internally or externally, in words or in some other form entirely. But beyond all the research and theory, beyond the scientific questions and philosophical puzzles, there's a more immediate and practical dimension to understanding inner speech. What does it mean for you right now as you navigate your daily life? How can awareness of your inner speech patterns help you live better, think more clearly, feel more at peace? Start by simply noticing. Over the next few days, pay attention to when inner speech appears and when it doesn't. You might be surprised to discover that it's less constant than you assumed, that large portions of your day involve other forms of consciousness. You might notice that inner speech tends to appear in particular contexts: when you're anxious, when you're problem solving, when you're preparing for social interaction, when you're trying to remember something. These patterns can tell you something about what inner speech is for in your particular cognitive ecology. Notice the quality of the voice itself. Is it fast or slow, loud or quiet? Whose voice does it resemble most closely? Your own, a parent, a teacher, a critical authority figure? The tone and character of your inner voice might reveal internalized relationships and attitudes that you've carried with you, perhaps without even realizing it. If you discover that your inner voice sounds suspiciously like a harsh parent or a mean schoolyard bully, that recognition itself can be liberating, allowing you to question whether you want to continue giving that voice power over your thoughts and feelings. Notice the content patterns as well. What percentage of your inner speech is positive versus negative? How much is focused on the past versus the future versus the present? How much is practical and task-oriented versus emotional and ruminative? These patterns aren't good or bad in themselves, but awareness of them gives you choice. If you discover that your inner speech is overwhelmingly self-critical, you can begin to consciously practice self-compassionate responses. If you notice that you spend hours mentally rehearsing conversations that never happen, you can experiment with redirecting that mental energy elsewhere. For some people, the discovery that not everyone has constant inner speech can be incredibly validating. If you've always felt like you think differently from others, like you don't have that constant internal narrator that everyone seems to assume is universal, knowing that you're not alone, that your way of thinking is just one valid variation on the human theme, can be deeply reassuring. You're not broken or less conscious or failing at some fundamental human task. You're simply built differently, and that difference is perfectly legitimate. For others, understanding that inner speech can be changed and cultivated might open up new possibilities. If you struggle with working memory or problem solving, deliberately developing stronger inner speech might help. This could involve practicing verbal self-guidance, literally talking yourself through tasks out loud until the pattern becomes more automatic and can be internalized. It could involve reading more, which seems to strengthen inner speech pathways. It could involve working with a therapist or coach who can help you develop more effective self-talk strategies. The relationship between inner speech and productivity deserves special attention. In an age of constant distraction, many people struggle to maintain focus and follow through on long-term goals. Inner speech can be a powerful tool for self-regulation, for talking yourself back on task when your attention wanders, for reminding yourself of your priorities, for encouraging yourself through difficult moments. But it can also be a source of distraction itself, endless mental chatter that prevents you from being fully present with whatever you're doing. Finding the right balance is key. Some tasks benefit from verbal self-guidance, especially complex tasks with multiple steps or tasks that require sustained motivation. Other tasks, particularly those requiring flow states or creative insight, might benefit from quieting the inner voice and allowing other forms of consciousness to emerge. Athletes often talk about getting out of their head and into their body, letting trained muscle memory take over, rather than trying to verbally direct every movement. Artists and musicians similarly describe their best work as happening when the analytical inner voice quiets and they enter a state of absorbed presence. This suggests that cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between different modes of thinking, including different uses of inner speech, might be more valuable than having any single pattern. You want to be able to engage in focused verbal reasoning when that's useful, to use inner speech for self-regulation and planning, but also to be able to quiet that voice when it's getting in the way, to access other forms of awareness and knowing that don't depend on language. Meditation and mindfulness practices can help develop this flexibility. By learning to observe inner speech without automatically engaging with it, you create some space around your thoughts. You see the voice in your head as an event occurring in consciousness rather than identifying completely with it. This doesn't mean eliminating inner speech, it means changing your relationship to it, treating it as one aspect of your mental life rather than the totality of who you are. There's also value in deliberately experimenting with different forms of inner speech. If you typically think in monologue, try deliberately constructing an internal dialogue, imagining someone asking you questions about what you're working on and formulating answers. You might be surprised at how this shifts your thinking, how playing both roles allows you to see problems from new angles. If you typically engage in extended inner dialogue, try condensing your thoughts into single words or short phrases, seeing if that abbreviated form allows for faster or more intuitive processing. You can also experiment with whose voice appears in your inner speech. If you're stuck on a problem, try mentally asking someone you respect what they would think about it, simulating their voice and perspective in your head. This isn't about what they would actually say. It's about using the simulation of their viewpoint to activate different parts of your own knowledge and different ways of thinking. You might mentally consult an imagined mentor, a wise elder, your future self looking back on this moment, even fictional characters whose perspectives you find valuable. This kind of deliberate perspective taking through inner speech can be a powerful, creative, and problem-solving tool. The connection between inner speech and writing deserves particular mention. For many writers, the act of writing is closely connected to inner speech. They're essentially transcribing the voice in their head. But this relationship can be problematic. If your inner voice is harsh and critical, it might paralyze your writing. That critical narrator shooting down every sentence before you can even get it on the page. Learning to separate the generating voice from the editing voice, to let the words flow without immediate critical commentary, is often crucial for overcoming writer's block. Some writers deliberately cultivate multiple inner voices for different purposes, a free-flowing generative voice for first drafts, a more analytical voice for revision, perhaps even distinct voices for different characters or different types of writing. This intentional cultivation of diverse inner speech patterns can make the writing process more flexible and productive, allowing access to different modes of creativity and different levels of critical analysis as needed. For speakers and performers, the relationship between inner speech and public speaking is similarly complex. Some people find that their inner voice helps them prepare and perform, that mentally rehearsing a speech or presentation makes the actual delivery smoother. Others find that too much inner speech during performance makes them self-conscious and stilted, that they perform better when they can quiet the analytical voice and speak more spontaneously from feeling and intuition. The key is knowing yourself, understanding what works for your particular cognitive style and the particular demands of the situation. There's no universally correct approach, no single relationship to inner speech that's optimal for everyone. The goal is to develop awareness of your patterns, flexibility to shift between different modes, and the ability to consciously choose how you want to deploy or restrain your inner voice based on what you're trying to accomplish. Looking at inner speech through this more personal, practical lens also reveals how much it's shaped by relationships and social contexts. The voice in your head echoes the voices of important people in your life, carries forward conversations and relationships from your past into your present. This means that changes in your relationships can change your inner speech. Forming new close relationships, especially in adulthood, can introduce new voices and new perspectives into your internal dialogue. Ending toxic relationships might gradually quiet the critical voices they left behind. Therapy and coaching relationships are particularly powerful in this regard because they're explicitly about introducing a new voice, a new way of thinking about yourself and your experiences. A good therapist offers not just specific advice, but a whole way of engaging with your thoughts and feelings, a relational stance of compassion and curiosity that you can gradually internalize. Over time, the therapist's voice becomes part of your inner speech, available as a resource for self-compassion and self-understanding even outside the therapy session. This social dimension of inner speech has implications for education as well. Teachers aren't just conveying information, they're potentially shaping the inner speech of their students, providing models for how to think through problems, how to talk to yourself about challenges and setbacks, how to maintain motivation and curiosity. A teacher who models patient, encouraging self-talk might help students develop more adaptive inner speech patterns. A teacher who is consistently critical and demanding might inadvertently install a harsh internal critic in their students' minds. Parents, of course, play an even more fundamental role. The way parents talk to and with their children, especially during moments of difficulty or learning, literally becomes the child's inner voice. This places an enormous responsibility on caregivers to be mindful of not just what they say, but how they say it, to model the kind of inner speech they want their children to eventually develop. Warm, patient, encouraging guidance from parents tends to produce warm, patient, encouraging inner speech in children. Harsh, critical, demanding interactions tend to produce harsh, critical, demanding inner voices. Understanding this shouldn't create guilt for parents who recognize they may have contributed to problematic inner speech patterns in their children. First, it's never too late to model better ways of self-talk and explicitly teach more adaptive inner speech. Second, children and adults alike have agency. Inner speech isn't determined solely by childhood experience, but can be consciously developed throughout life. The voice you inherited from your upbringing is a starting point, not a destiny. There's also the question of collective inner speech, shared narratives and voices that aren't just personal but cultural. Every culture has characteristic ways of thinking about the self, characteristic patterns of internal experience that get reinforced through language, stories, educational practices, and social norms. Some cultures emphasize individual achievement and might produce inner speech focused on personal goals and self-assessment. Others emphasize social harmony and might produce inner speech more focused on relationships and collective responsibilities. These cultural patterns aren't deterministic, but they create strong defaults, making certain forms of inner speech feel natural and obvious, while others feel strange or difficult. Becoming aware of these cultural dimensions can be liberating, allowing you to question whether the inner voice you have is really yours, or whether it's primarily an internalization of cultural expectations that you may or may not actually endorse. Ultimately, exploring your inner speech is a journey of self-discovery and self-creation. You're not just observing a fixed phenomenon, but actively engaging with something that can change and develop. The voice in your head, or whatever form your inner experience takes, is both a window into who you've been and a tool for becoming who you want to be. It carries your history, but doesn't have to define your future. This journey requires patience and self-compassion. If you discover that your inner voice is harsher than you realized, that recognition itself might be painful, you might feel grief or anger about the ways you've been talking to yourself, the ways that internal criticism has held you back or caused unnecessary suffering. Those feelings are valid and worth honoring, and they're also the beginning of change, because you can't transform what you're not aware of. Give yourself permission to experiment, to be playful with your inner speech. Try on different voices, different tones, different patterns. Notice what feels authentic versus forced, what seems helpful versus performative. There's no rubric for getting it right, no test you need to pass. This is your mind, your consciousness, your internal experience. You get to decide what you want it to be like, and that decision itself is an act of autonomy and self-determination. Remember too that silence has value. Not every moment needs to be filled with inner speech. Not every experience needs to be narrated or analyzed or explained. Some of the richest moments of being alive might be precisely those times when the voice quiets, when you're simply present with sensation and emotion and awareness, when you're in the world rather than commenting on it from inside your head. The voice inside your head, or its absence, is ultimately one thread in the vast tapestry of human consciousness. Understanding it better means understanding yourself better, understanding the remarkable diversity of human experience better, and potentially opening up new possibilities for how you engage with your own mind. That's a worthwhile endeavor, whether pursued through meditation or therapy or research or simply careful self-observation. The journey of understanding inner speech is really a journey of understanding consciousness itself, and it's a journey that will continue long into the future. Every answer we find raises new questions. Every method we develop reveals new complexities. But that's the nature of studying the mind from within the mind, of using consciousness to investigate consciousness. It's both impossibly difficult and endlessly fascinating, a puzzle that might never be fully solved, but that's worth pursuing precisely because it touches on the deepest questions about what it means to be human, to be aware, to be alive and thinking in this strange and wonderful universe.
Madre, que nutres a la semilla. Despierta.